Okay, well, welcome everyone to another webinar from the Blockchain Research Institute. We have a terrific topic today and a terrific group of panelists, or we're going to have a big fireside chat here as the case may be. And just one thing that we do intend to do is to take the transcript from this conversation and turn it into a report. We're going to turn that around quickly, and this report will, unlike many of our other deliverables, will not be proprietary initially to our clients and members of the BRI, but will in fact be made as a public document for everyone to see. So the topic today is our digital identities. And to me, this is a big deal, like a really big deal. If we don't turn back the tide on climate change, we don't get to exist as a species. If we don't turn back the tide on the ownership of data, I don't think we get to exist as a civilization, because owning our own identities will be the foundation of prosperity, the autonomy and security of the individual, of freedom, and of our ability as societies to tackle big social problems regarding data, like, say, a pandemic. And so the background on this is that this is bigger than identification of an individual. It's all about the data that we create in the digital world that constitutes our identity. And data is the asset class of the digital age. And our data identities consist of many attributes and assets, including dozens of categories of data. And the virtual you is created by you, but it's owned by others. The virtual you knows more about you than you do in all kinds of areas, because you can't remember your exact location a year ago, or what you spent money on a year ago, or what diagnosis you had, or what medication you took, or what you got on a test. Dozens of classes of data. And this data is captured by a new species of business. In a 2006 report, we called it the digital conglomerates. And these digital conglomerates, through their ownership of data, are now, the top 5 of them are half of the value of NASDAQ and 20% of the S&P 500. So the real problem here is that the virtual you is not owned by you, it's owned by these entities and governments. And the virtual you isn't held by you, it's stored in silos around the world. The virtual you isn't used by you, it's available to any entity wanting to do big data analytics. The virtual data isn't monetized by you, it's driving the market cap of these digital conglomerates. And you yet are responsible if the virtual you is hacked, robbed, or deleted. And the virtual you runs on centralized servers, of which there are 2 types: those that have been hacked and those that will be hacked. So the topic today is, why is this a problem, and how do we reclaim our digital identities? And we're going to introduce the idea of the self-sovereign identity and talk practically about what's going on and how we can move to achieve such a thing. We have a great group of discussants, and I want to get right into it. I'm going to introduce all of them, and then I'm going to pose some questions and for the group as a whole. And we're going to mix it up here and see where it goes. And feel free to bring in your questions and comments, and just submit them to the chat. And I'll be keeping an eye on these, and we have moderators that are going to surface some questions that we think will help with the conversation. First is our good friend, Brian Bellendorf, who's General Manager for Blockchain, Healthcare, and Identity at the Linux Foundation. And Brian is the Executive Director of Hyperledger. He was as many of you know, he's a legend in my mind, for sure. He was the developer of the Apache web server. It's the most popular web server software on the internet, and a founding member of the Apache Software Foundation. And he's been on the board of the Mozilla Foundation since 2003, the EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, since 2013. And Brian is actually the CTO of the World Economic Forum, and I worked with him in that capacity. Secondly, we have Stephen Curran, who's with Cloud Compass Computing, Inc. It's a software developer and DevOps veteran who dove full on into what has become the trust over IP world. And that was in 2017. And he's working today as a consultant with the government of British Columbia. And Stephen's helped define, build, launch a variety of production and proof of concept applications built on verifiable credentials. Stephen's a regular contributor in the Hyperledger Indie and Hyperledger Aries communities. And he's also the co-author of edX courses on Hyperledger. And Stephen is a trustee of the Sovereign Foundation, which is, you'll learn about that in a minute, that's driving a lot of the work around the notion of a self-sovereign identity. Nathan George is a senior director of engineering for the protocol team at Kiva Microfunds. And at Kiva, Nathan works on enabling protocol level solutions for data ownership and financial inclusion for the estimated 1.7 billion unbanked persons worldwide. And previously, Nathan served as the CTO of the Sovereign Foundation and coordinated the foundation's technology vision to bring verifiable credentials exchange and sovereign identity for all. And Nathan was also a software architect at Everum, where he worked on the original team that created the Sovereign platform. And we'll learn about both of those in a second. So welcome, everybody. We have a packed crowd here today due to the limitations of Zoom and the license that we have for these things. 500 people, we actually had to close the registration. So let's start with, I waxed on a little bit about the problem today, that we create the data, but it's owned by others. But I'd be interested in each of you kind of talking about that a bit. And what is the current approach to our digital identities? And that can include identification or the broader concept of identity. And why, in your mind, is that a problem? So Brian, why don't we start with you?
Great. Well, thank you, Don. It's so great to be here. And Don, I really appreciated knowing you for most of the last 2 decades as well. It's been really fun. So I certainly want to leave room for Nathan and Stephen to talk about kind of the formal definition for self-sovereign identity and the principles that underlay it. The bigger picture kind of thing here is, I think enough of us are sick and tired of the very portal-driven view of how digital identity works, that you are defined by what some other institution knows about you and maintains in their databases. Think about your Facebook account, your Twitter account, your account at the California Department of Motor Vehicles when I go in to reissue my driver's license, or at the IRS or something like that. All of that puts identity kind of at an arm's length, right, on the other end of a name and password, which hopefully I don't forget, or my email address doesn't become unreachable or something like that. Otherwise, I'm hosed. Instead, a lot of us, I think, want to view identity as an inversion of that, something where you hold these signed documents very close to you as very much the digital analog of the physical version of your wallet, right? Where you are not defined by it, but really where what you're holding are documents that are signed that attest to certain things about you. That is, a driver's license that is a signature of thing, or a ski pass, for example, that says I have a right to go ski at a certain ski resort all winter, right? Or a diploma, or or some other kind of certificate of having achieved an educational accomplishment. These are things that you hold in the real world and can show to somebody else. And even if that school goes out of business business, you can still present that diploma to somebody and they can verify it and go, okay, yeah, this was a legitimate degree that was conferred. And that's something we don't have right now. If Facebook were to disappear, I know a thought that we can't conceive of now, but we only have to remember AOL and Yahoo and other things to realize that every one of these has a lifespan shorter than the average human lifespan, to go, maybe these things should be more indigenous to who we are. And I think that's the bigger picture view of what self-sovereign identity is about, and something that we've seen in the Hyperledger community, a lot of work done in the Hyperledger Indian areas with Stephen, which Stephen and Nathan have played a really core role in helping build. But now in other associated communities like the Trust Over IP Foundation, which started last year, and especially now are becoming relevant in this world where everyone's really focused on how do we reopen and provide proof of vaccination or clear health status to board a plane or to enter a sporting event or something like that. Suddenly now this is becoming very real, and the privacy issues in this becoming very real. So it's a very exciting space to be working in.
Okay, Stephen, to you next. What is the current approach to our identities, and why in your mind is that a problem? We'll hold off on solutions for now.
Yeah, so the current approach is that you ask other people to share data with other people, other entities. So you want to log into something, and so you ask Facebook to tell the other person who you are. And so you are in control of it. You are controlling when it happens, but you're actually asking Facebook to tell some other service, hey, that's Stephen, let him in. And and we're giving that control over them. That tells Facebook every time we do anything, adds to their single database of everything. And the other part of it is, Brian displayed, his license and his ski pass and things like that, these paper things. So, we're using these paper things, but they're very simple to forge. And as a result, there's not a lot of trust in them. And that has all sorts of implications of the fact that there's no trust in these documents you've got. And so we're trying to take the systems we've used for many years and use them, but we're trying to do it up until now. We've been doing it using basic technology, scanning documents, taking pictures of them, showing them to people and counting on them to take their validity. And as a result, there's a bunch of implications for that, which gets into the solution. So I'll stop there.
Nathan.
Well, and if I can add something to that, now that we've reached kind of this digital saturation where everything's interconnected, we're having troubles because, your healthcare data, it's your vaccination record, doesn't talk to your airline. Your airline data doesn't talk to the government and immigration office that then needs to let you in. And so we end up in a situation where all these systems would have to collectively merge or become one, or we have to make it so that the people involved have the opportunity to move that data themselves. But that has to happen in the same way paper credentials happen, where when you get the physical credential or the passport or the vaccination pass, there's some truthiness to it. They can tell that it's legitimate, that they can tell that it's what they're supposed to use. And when we talk about passports, it took us forever to get to a standard that lets everybody work really well. And that's probably the simplest use case we have internationally. Then we get to driver's licenses where there are very good standards. But if I showed you a driver's license from Utah, would you know whether it was a legitimate Utah driver's license or not? And that's the hope, is that we can get to where all the way out at the edge, even for things like what your social contacts or the individual line items in your resume, when someone sees these things, they can get a sense of whether it's true. And it doesn't have to come from Facebook, or it doesn't have to come from your university to know that it's true. You can share that with them and they can look at it and go, yeah, that's a legitimate university degree. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, and to that point about that we can't aggregate or link this data together, say in a pandemic, the reason that this whole thing is happening is because of data or lack thereof, that we didn't have the data, the health data that was all locked in individual healthcare systems or in our bodies, that was not able to be aggregated across all of these silos for epidemiologists and government planners to be able to take action. And so let's just explore this idea between identification, like who you are, and the broader issue of identity, like what you are, how is your health? What transactions do you do? What is your location and so on? Brian, do you want to pick that up? I know it's kind of a continuum, but they're different topics in some ways.
Well, from a human rights point of view, which I think is a frame that we should really root ourselves in. From a humanist point of view, you are not defined by what other administrations or other organizations say you are or about you, right? This has been a big realization in the kind of the activist circles ever since Facebook introduced their real names policy. And suddenly you realize, people's real names change, not just for weddings or whatever, but or getting married, but people going through transitions in life of different sorts, people who are fleeing domestic abuse, people who are fleeing countries where suddenly they become persona non grata, and there's somebody in that country destined to destroy you as a human, right? So it's interesting to see the context and a question around digital identity emerge in refugee environments. I've been on the board of technical advisors for ID 2020 for a couple of years now, which has been thinking about how do you use digital identity systems to help guarantee to refugees access to services and the like, and help them actually bridge into the societies that they're emerging into without it becoming a tool for an oppressive regime to start to chase after its unwanted diaspora, right, and cause problems for them. You can think about certain countries where that's certainly happened. And so rerouting this in a very humanist view that says, no one tells you who you are, you say who you are, but there are institutions out there who have things they want to say about you and sign that, and that you want to be able to confer that to others. Again, the diploma is the ideal example of this, right? You went to a school, you passed their tests. You want to be able to show to an employer or anyone else who asks, this is a legitimate thing that I accomplished somewhere else, right? This is not about defining your eye color or defining, your gender. This is about what are other people saying about me that I want to be able to prove to others. And I think if we spend more time thinking about identity in that respect, at least digital identity in that respect, we can make room for more sense of personal agency on the part of, really who you are from a humanist point of view. And I think that's a foundational understanding in the people working on these technologies.
Stephen, Nathan, from identification to the virtual you and all the rich data that contains.
I think that leads into another part of it, which is how you take that control of your attributes, your information, and scale it digitally. One of the things when you're not Facebook and when you're not just selling the data, but you're someone like a government, and I want to be very clear that I am not part of the BC government and don't speak on behalf of them or any of their policies. So I always like to make sure that's well understood. But there's a lot of rules that the BC government has applied, governments are all around apply to how they can use data, how they can share data, how they separate the data to make sure that they're not creating, and I know this is very true in British Columbia, is they are not creating a single database that has all the attributes of a person as they know it. They have divided it all into programs and keep them separate. They take a lot of effort to make sure that they don't distribute that data easily, that they make sure they're checking who they're distributing it to, and all of that prevents scale. What this is doing in unlocking the data, in providing it to the citizen, allowing the citizen to make choices of when they share them and how they share them, allows that integration to happen not between organizations and enterprises that don't know each other, but between the person and the entities that they want to work with. And that really enables scale. And that's what we're looking for.
Yeah.
Well, and this is where it's really important to remember that this is about inclusion and inclusion over time, right? When we think of traditional blockchains, we put everything on this decentralized system and we make it all immutable. So we all have it and we can all see it. And that's actually an anti-pattern for most identity, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to give control over correlation to the entity that's the subject of that correlation, so that they can assert it when they want it and they can avoid it when they don't want it, right? That way relationships stay within the relationship, right? Your personal details that you share with the spouse or significant other are different than the details you'd share maybe at a business conference, right? That's intentional. And that gives us power, not just in a empowerment sense of I can control who I am and who I want to become over time, but also in terms of accomplishing business, right? If Apple knew everything about Samsung's supply chain all the time and could see it all on a ledger, they wouldn't use that ledger, right? Because it discloses too much and it prevents them from having, the flexibility they need to adjust to changes in their market. Because what happens and what's true now isn't necessarily true off into the future and off into the distance. So when we talk about like, let's just put our DNA in an NFT and there we have an identity, right? That makes it so that there is an immutability and a strong correlation with everything everywhere all the time that prevents identity from happening. And this is an interesting evolution to our overall blockchain ecosystem, because we have to start thinking about not only the decentralization of the infrastructure, but the decentralization of the meaning of things and the language we use. And that's really exciting.
Brian, I see you chuckling about that.
Yeah, if I can add, I mean, a thought that comes to mind is something a friend of mine, Don Marty, said once. When there was this realization that with GDPR and with privacy disasters, we were hitting a tipping point where data might be the new oil, but data spills are the new oil spill. Insofar as the damage that they can cause and the pervasiveness of that. And really we've seen in the last 5-10 years a move towards data minimization, or if you have data, treat it like an asset, but a kind of a toxic asset if you're not actively making use of that. And I think self-sovereign identity takes it in a different direction, which is to say, you should be in control, you should be the pivot point for that information exchange. And even to the degree where the issuers of these credentials don't have the right to know where you're using these credentials, right? There's no architectural connection that requires that they get notified or pinged or asked, is this credential valid? You should be able to use a government-issued driver's license, digital driver's license, if it's using SSI, to go to a bar without anybody in the government knowing which bar you're going to, right? And that's an important principle. It's something that when we were doing the cookie 25 years ago and the architecture of that, and we said, there might be these privacy issues where if you embed these 1-by-1 pixels on people's web pages, then somebody could aggregate the data about where you go. We all said, no, that would be creepy. Who would do that, right? Let's not worry about that as an architectural flaw, because like people would riot, and they'd go with their pitchforks to the offices doing that. And nobody rioted. And that wasn't, we're being a lot more cautious now about how these architectures are being built. And I think the self-sovereign identity principles are embodiment of that.
Yeah, if I could talk about a couple of those.
Just before you go there, Stephen. So maybe a good adjective for the new paradigm is creepy, because that's kind of what's happened, isn't it? If you think way back, I mean, I remember when I learned to drive as a 16-year-old, data was in little silos and it was all physical. It wasn't even in computers. And if you got stopped by a policeman on the road, they'd ask for your driver's license. I don't think they had access to your criminal record, and they sure couldn't ask you what is your, what's your medical record, or give me your credit card number, or something like that. Now, police can't do that today, but as all this data turns into bits, the institutions that have power are able to capture this data. So I just want to summarize on this first topic then, why we have Houston, we have a problem here. And it's not a simple thing. There are, I'm going to say 5 different problems. Number one is we create the data, others own it and control it. That means we don't have access to it to plan our lives. Imagine if we had access to all this rich healthcare data or transactional data or locational data or something like that, how they could help us. Secondly, it means that we can't monetize this data. So they're becoming the most wealthy institutions in all of history. Jared Lanier, I've never seen his backup for this statement, but the last time I was at Davos, he said that there are close to 2 billion people in the world who could double their income if they had the ability to monetize their data. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but this data is worth a lot. And we create it, but we don't get anything for it. The third problem, and Stephen has picked this up, is that it's not secure. So it's going to be hacked, or will be, or it has been hacked or lost or something. And we're going to be picking up the pieces. The fourth problem that you've all alluded to is we can't use this data for any kind of social purposes, like say in a pandemic. And the fifth problem is that, of course, our privacy is being undermined. And people say to me, well, Don, privacy is dead. Get over it. You know, if you got nothing to hide, what's your problem? This is stupidity, because privacy to me is the foundation of freedom. And all this data represents our identities, and we need to get it back so that we can manage it responsibly. And if you think that we should just get over the problem of privacy, check out the social score in China. That you do something bad, according to the government, pay a parking ticket, or God forbid, go on a demonstration, and all of a sudden your kid doesn't get into a good school. You have no idea why. So the stakes here are very, very high. So what are we going to do? Nationalize large companies. How about that? No, that's probably not a strategy. We've been using this term self-sovereign identity. What is that? And how would it affect the lives of citizens? And Stephen, or Nathan, why don't we start with you and we'll work backwards this time, okay?
So societies are built on relationships, and they scale up from there, right? And when we forget that, that's where things get strange, right? No one wants their algorithm to be the creepy used car salesman that's not sharing the information it's supposed to be sharing, right? Recommendation algorithms are just supposed to be that, a friendly recommendation. And when we lose the transparency and when we lose that relationship-based interaction is when things fall off the rails. And logically, it's been that way because we haven't had the technology in the past to make it different. And part of what I hope the audience hears as we talk through how this technology works is that's changed now. We know how to control correlation. We know how to selectively disclose things with the cryptography we have. And when we carefully put those building blocks together, we can bring the information that's moving back and forth back into the context of a relationship. It's not about asserting whatever you want, wherever you want, or being whatever you want, wherever you want to be it, right? It's okay to have social accountability to your nation or to your local community or to the grocery store vendor that you didn't eat the produce before you got to the checkout stand, right? That's normal. That's appropriate. It's about making sure that it's part of that relationship so that you understand the context and you can share what makes sense and not share what doesn't make sense, right? That's why the 1x1 pixels were so creepy, because no one told you they were there, right? It wasn't part of the relationship, and it was a betrayal of that relationship when it wasn't disclosed. If Facebook can tell me about local businesses that I'd like to go visit and like to go be a part of, that makes me feel good. That's a good reinforcement of a relationship. But if they track my online activity and manipulate the news I see to try to make me vote a certain way, not that the people I've met at Facebook have any desire to do that, but even if it makes me feel like they did that, then I don't know what to do. I don't know what to trust. And that's really what we're trying to get back to, is to make it so that that trust is centered on those relationships so people can form and strengthen their societies.
Stephen.
Whoa, that was good. Listen to what Nathan says. I'm going to talk just briefly about a couple of the tools and capabilities that it gives you. We've talked a bit about, with self-sovereign identity, this idea that it's really a lot like the paper credentials you get. But rather than being a piece of paper that someone inspects, it's based on some cryptography, math, and things like that, digitally signing things that allow you to determine who issued the credential, to whom it was issued, that it was issued to me, that it hasn't been tampered with, and it hasn't been revoked. So those four things that you learn with a verifiable credential when you look at it are not done by inspection by some expert in forgery looking at them. They're actually done by the math involved in it, the digital process. Eliminates forgery, and it enables trusted transactions. So when you go to a website and you're asked to type in your identifier, your social security number, or in Canada, your SIN, you just type it in, and of course, nobody believes it because those are all over the internet, right? But if you supply that information from a verifiable credential that is issued by the organization that has the authority over it and issued to you, and it can prove it's not tampered with, you get trusted interaction. So that's the basis of it. You control what you share and when. there's privacy involved. You are the one that's presenting the data. The verifier is looking at it. Nobody else is looking at it. The issuer's not watching you do it. Facebook's not watching you do it. You're doing it in connection with that person. And lastly, you can really minimize the amount of data. You know, when you go to the bank and they say, well, we need 2 pieces of information, 2 pieces of identity plus a government ID and so on. They're doing that to mitigate their risk because they know many people can forge things. So they want 3 or 4 correlating pieces of data. Now they can accept the data as is presented, and they can minimize what they have to collect and minimize what they have to keep because they don't need that audit trail, those pieces to continue tracking you.
Now, let me just ask you a little question on one of those things. You said enabling trust and access. In your mind, is there a differentiation between identification and authorization? Like, you know, after 9/11, you got to show identity entering into big buildings in New York. But the building actually doesn't care who you are. What they really should care about is that you're an authorized person to enter this building, right?
Absolutely.
Is that a fair distinction?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely a difference between authentication, who you are, and then what you're authorized to do. And that is entirely contextual. We have a project that I was lucky enough to work on in British Columbia that said the government wanted to allow access to a system to lawyers. And how do they do that? And asking a person their name isn't really going to get you there. So what we created was the ability for the Law Society of British Columbia to issue a credential to lawyers so that when they came to this site, they could say, I'm a lawyer and here's my status. Here's my current status as known by the Law Society. And that allows authorization at the same time, because it doesn't matter, as you say, there's somewhat you need to know who the person is, but you really want to know what their authorization is to do what's necessary. And in this case, authorization came to lawyers.
Right. Brian, what's a self-sovereign identity?
Well, I mean, playing on this theme of differences between these two things, and I think it gets to your question. You know, in the context of vaccination credentials, which are in the news and the like, we are going to see a bunch of tools emerge. We have started to see a bunch of apps emerge. You know, the Excelsior Pass in New York State. Many countries have started to deploy these now, and we're going to see them evolve, I think, over time to handle these 2 different kinds of things. One thing is a proof that you've received a vaccine or the second dose and which vaccines and that sort of thing. And that's health data, right? Likewise, a test result. That's health data. That's something you want to keep pretty close in, something you might want to share with a doctor, but you don't necessarily want to, just like in the real world, you don't want to, like when you want to go to a ball game, you don't want to have to bring test results with you and show to everybody who asks, right? There's a second category of a credential, which is really going to be more data limited, more privacy focused, which is really just essentially a thumbs up, a green check, a single signature that maybe it's attached to your name. Maybe it's not even attached to your name. It's attached to like a fuzzed out photo of you or something. Yeah. And that is the kind of pass that should be presented to be able to enter a ball game. Where does the sports stadium need to know the identity of you and your 6 kids that you're bringing with you to go attend the game? Probably they don't need to know that. They just need to know, has everyone been vaccinated or has a recent, recent all clear test? And the verifiable credential system, and we should note, just as a nuts and bolts kind of thing, when we talk about verifiable credentials, there is a specific standard defined by the World Wide Web Consortium for how those work. There's other layers of standards that have been honed over the last 3-4 years around how to share these credentials, how to present them both face-to-face or even online when you're booking a flight to show that you have you've received a vaccine, that sort of thing. And there's been now many companies that have implemented wallets and issuers and verifier software for this, and a lot of open source software that's the underpinning for this. So what the 3 of us here are talking about, the 4 of us here are talking about today, is not some aspirational, somebody ought to build this one day kind of pie in the sky. We're talking about production systems that are going into deployment, and especially with the interest in Vax credentials, being asked to be pressed into service for an incredibly both important thing, reopening society, but also intensely privacy sensitive kind of domain, which is everyone's health.
So, and this is where I think there's something else to add here, which is Most developers are really familiar with the difference between authentication and authorization. They've been burned by it, and so they know how to deal with the difference. But it turns out that identification is actually a third thing. It's not the same thing as authorization or authentication. And when you see a system, especially a blockchain system, that uses the same number for someone, or even uses the same cryptographic key for someone that follows them around, you know it's broken. You don't even have to keep going. You know that that system is broken. Because if you're not controlling the correlation of those ID numbers as they move around in the system's not going to work over time. It's going to collapse. It's going to fall down because you can't yet let those pieces of data move around freely within the system without undermining the person that's the subject of that data.
Yeah. Okay. So here we have this virtual you that's owned by you. Now it's called a sovereign identity. And Nathan, I wonder if you could just pick up about sovereign, the organization. First of all, is it sovereign? Is it really totally controlled by the individual? Because surely governments have a legitimate right to be the sources of attestation of certain types of information, as the universities have the right to attest to your academic credentials and so on. So could you describe that? And then what is sovereign and how does it fit into all of this?
Well, when you think about sovereign, the organization, that name came from this idea that your data has a border. And when you have some control over what data you accept into your border and what data you release out of your border, right? And that's really all that was about. And the data comes from a relationship. And that actually strengthens and means that if you are the official source of government ID cards, well, gosh, no one else should be telling everybody else what a government ID card is and what a government ID card should be. You are the issuer of that data, and you have the right to decide what that data means and how that data is defined. Now, when I receive my government ID card, I should have the right to decide who I show it to and where I show it. You know, if I want to show my in-laws that my government ID card is cooler than theirs, I shouldn't be stopped from doing that, right? That's actually a reputational benefit back to that government, but it's certainly not their intended use case, right? And in fact, most times the picture in your government ID card is not something you want to show anyone. So that ability to share or not to share is really the focus that we talk about when we talk about that word sovereign.
Okay, so let's talk about technology. You've mentioned blockchain. Somebody said the word wallet. Brian, we'll start with you. How are we going to do this? Why not have a big centralized government computer that owns all of this data that we can trust and that enables us to use the data safely and appropriately ourselves?
I mean, why don't we have
that-
Facebook?
Sorry?
Why don't we have Facebook?
I was just about to say, I mean, you could put, a government there, you could put the US government, you could put Facebook there, you could put other, companies, and brands are highly trusted. Apple and Google are highly trusted brands out there, right? Perhaps in many cases ranking higher than the government's, and we know the Edelman Trust Survey, has shown a 20-year straight decline in trust in all sorts of institutions, and even professions and brands and all those sorts of things. So we're in a world where trust is declining around us. That's almost a pithy statement. But even if we were to say, why not let a government run it, right? Well, people cross borders all the time. People engage in international systems all the time, right? I might want to buy a product from another country and have it shipped here. I might want to send an email or prove my vaccination status or my diploma to somebody in another country. And so suddenly the question of whose government runs this, is it the UN, et cetera, becomes, you see where the logical, silly end result of that would be. So the world is decentralized inherently, and we need to build architectural systems like the original internet that reflect that decentralization. And the use of blockchain technology here is not, for ICO purposes to make a bunch of us rich or anything like that. It's not for, to drive a token kind of thing. It's not because blockchain is magic pixie dust that makes everything secure. If anything, it's the opposite. As you've heard us acknowledge, having a single system of record that cannot be deleted from is a nightmare from a privacy and GDPR compliance point of view, et cetera. What it is good for is looking at how do we reinvent how public key infrastructure works at the top level, right? How do we get to something that is an even better decentralized system than we have with the domain name system, where ICANN manages this top level root set of domain name services. They do a pretty decent job of it, but I think it'd be hard for us to recreate an ICANN in 2021 if we tried, because they had the benefit of starting, before anyone knew how important the internet was going to be. We don't have that luxury right now. Everything is so politicized, and venture capital flows to people who build centralized systems out there rather than decentralized ones. So really the use of blockchain here is to try to say, for the people who are issuing credentials, how do you discover whether their signatures are valid? What is the trust framework around being able to know, is this vaccination certificate, is this a valid one, or one that came from something that Stephen signed to me so that I could get into Canada or something like that, right? There's a bit of the root of trust there. And I think there's some other uses down the road for things like recording consent agreements, so that I can prove I can prove I have consent for the data you shared with me, as well as you can then revoke it and prove that you've revoked it, right? There's some interesting ways this might be used in the long term, but at its root level, it's not about storing personal data on any blockchain. It's about helping verify the integrity of signatures and trust frameworks.
Nathan.
So when we talk about the building blocks, I want every person, organization, and thing to have two things. Someplace to store their stuff, right? That's what we call a wallet, where you can keep your secrets, right? So they're yours and uniquely yours. And we want you to have an agent. When we say an agent, it's the software that works on your behalf that is uniquely yours. It doesn't work for anyone else. But what it lets you do is it lets you take all that stuff you have, it lets you manage it, it lets you issue new stuff to others, it lets you hold the things others issue to you, and it lets you verify anything that everyone else has shared with you. And when we have those two building blocks, data can flow not just from one system of record to another system of record. Data can flow by means of any channel you have available to you. And that's the thing that really makes a difference for inclusion. Because if my country is a poor country and no one wants to spend the time doing systems integrations with us, I can still use my stuff. If I get forced out of my country and I end up washed up somewhere else, I can still use my stuff. If someone sells me their car, well, if their car comes with all of its credentials, I still have all of that car's provable stuff. And now information management becomes a lot easier because it's about the relationships we have with all the things around us, the way humans naturally think, instead of it being about a lot of cryptography and a lot of secrets.
Stephen, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think in this discussion, there is blockchain involved, but as both Brian and Nathan have said, it's very different. So when you want to look into this and dig into it, you really want to understand verifiable credentials and the verifiable credential models and how similar it is to paper credentials and the paper credentials you've had that we've been using for about 2,500 years in society. And making sure that that's understood, and the fact that there is a bunch of technology underneath it. There is a bunch of technology involved. The blockchain is what allows you to share your data with another entity and not have that identity go back to the verifier or to the issuer of the data to find out whether it's true, to call home and find out, hey, Stephen wants to use his card to buy some cannabis. Should he be allowed to do that? These are the things you want to avoid. And the blockchain allows us to have that decentralized place to go without going back to it. And that's all that the blockchain is for. So the real thing to understand in this and to dig into is verifiable credentials. Nathan talked about storage of them. In fact, as the thing about vaccine credentials is coming out of whether you've been vaccinated, paper versions of those are absolutely necessary because we want everyone to have one. Well, in fact, you can have a verifiable credential on a piece of paper. It's not quite as useful and it's not as privacy preserving. It's not as secure as having an agent on your phone that shares the data and limits how much data it's showing. But it is a way to represent that data in just as authentic a manner so that the data can be trusted. So there's different ways to handle it. The important thing is that concept of verifiable credentials and how it carries us from paper credential world to a verifiable world.
Now, Brian, I know you're passionate about the wallet. In fact, you may remember a couple of years ago at one of our events, you posed this provocative question: is the wallet to blockchain as the browser was to the internet? And I remember I gave a very profound answer for about 30 seconds and I ran out of gas. So we actually did a project on it. But how does the wallet fit into this whole question?
So it's a big topic, and obviously the cryptocurrency community has been very wallet happy for its existence. But we've ended up in a world where we have hundreds of different wallets for different cryptocurrencies that are very much attached to an exchange. You know, like your Coinbase wallet, et cetera, which is about as useful when you think about it as having web browsers that are attached to specific search engines. Well, I guess we had that with Chrome, but that's why I use Firefox. But imagine a world where you had hundreds of different web browsers, and maybe every person would have dozens on their laptop. That would be a tragedy, right? Having to switch between them. And doubly a tragedy if you had 40 wallets in your phone, because some of them are about spending Bitcoin, some are about spending US dollars, others are PayPal, or you only use this wallet to talk to that exchange. And so there's a need for interoperability in payments. And this is related to identity, because so much of the payments world is focused on ensuring you are who you say you are, right? Your credentials to be able to use PayPal and spend out from your PayPal linked accounts, right? Or to do an exchange on an exchange which typically does want to know, you know, has to perform KYC on its members. And this is becoming increasingly important with the rise of central bank digital currencies, where we actually will see digital dollars, digital loonies, digital euro issued by the national authorities. If all of these are going to be separate apps on your phone, that's going to be a tragedy. And so there are a bunch of folks who've been working on specifications for what a universal wallet would look like. There is wallet software. This is what the Aries project has been at Hyperledger for the last couple of years. That has increasingly grown in terms of end user sophistication. There's even these native open source native wallets now, and React Native client, that sort of thing. There's still important questions to ask around, you know, where is the data in your wallet backed up? How do you harmonize the wallet from your mobile phone to another device, to your laptop? Who do you choose to be the person who stores the keys to your assets, right? The cryptocurrency community takes, you know, their prerogative there is all your keys are on your local device, and, you know, you have to locally back it up or remember your key phrase. That's not a very usable thing for the majority of folks out there. So most of us are going to trust that repo data to another party, maybe even to an Apple and Google, the way we do with so much of our other life, but that doesn't put them in any privileged position to know how you're spending it or where you're going. So the wallet thing is really important. And I think we will see the rise of open source wallets that are more local to you, the way that, say, you think of your web browser or your mail client as being local to you in a way that I don't think most people think of their Uber app as being local to them. They're not really in control of the data in the Uber app. They don't use Uber to go hire other cars or other information services. And yet from email, you're so used to being able to email anyone else with an email address, no matter what other service they're on, whether they're on Gmail or whatever. And all these systems should work like email. These credentials I should be able to manage and present to anyone else as long as we're interoperable to the same set of standards. And that's really should be the consumer expectation in this space, is how do we get this to be now, in addition to my email client and my web client, my third most common app on my phone that I open is my wallet, from which I prove my identities and spend real money or digital assets or whatever from, and really think of as a trio of apps that work on my behalf rather than on someone else's behalf.
As always with these webinars, time is flying here. We've got about a little over 10 minutes left. So let's talk about, okay, we know the problem. I think we know the general topic of solutions. It has to do with the self-sovereign identity. We know some of the technologies that are important, wallet, blockchain, and so on. How are we going to get there? So, rather than going through each of these different categories, I'd like to, I'll just mention them all and then get each of you to comment. So there's a role for civil society, surely, things like the Sovereign Foundation, the standards organizations, W3C consortium, and so on. There's a role for entrepreneurs. Nathan, you're trying to make it happen. Evrim is another example. Maybe you could describe that. There's a role for government. I'd like to sort of explore what that is. And then I don't know if there's a role for Mark Zuckerberg or for Google. I know that Satya Nadella has alluded to the fact that data is a really big problem, that people ought to own their own data. And Microsoft, I think, is the most valuable company in the world. It's right up there, and it's certainly one of these digital conglomerates. So I don't know, Stephen, why don't we start with
Yeah,
you? How are we going to get there?
let me touch the government side of it.
Yeah.
The issue we have here is it's a multi-sided market. So it's a classic issue with nobody issues credentials because nobody has a wallet. Nobody has a wallet because nobody issues credentials. And so you've got this, something's got to start it. The role that government can play is government issues lots of often authoritative data. They issue, as we talked about, just core identity documents, but many parts of the government is to do with issuing permits and licenses and registering businesses and things like that. One of the things that the BC government did that I got to work on a lot is starting the exploration in this space by using organizational data, because corporations are people too, right? We dealt with data there and issued credentials and worked with how to do that to create issuers inside the government at an organizational level, because all the data was public. And even if we really screwed it up, all the data is already public. But that gave us lots of patterns to learn. It gave us lots of experience with the tool. So I think the government has a big role because it can really improve the security and privacy for citizens on the net, on the internet, and allow them to use the internet, use services, but do it safely and securely so that they don't have to worry about constantly being scammed, their data being stolen and used without their knowledge and things like that. Those are the big things that government can do.
Okay. Well, if corporations are people, I guess things are people too. That's
Yeah.
something we never got into, is we have billions, soon trillions of inert objects that have an identity. And it's not just who they are, but I mean, when this light bulb buys some power from a distributed power source and it pays promptly, its reputation as a trustworthy light bulb will be enhanced, and that's part of its identity.
There's a real world example of that so there's a consortium called MOBI, which I believe, I'm sure you've had a webinar on, or as part of the BRI, who have been developing in conjunction with the automotive industry and with regulators the concept of attaching essentially the VIN number that is on every car to a decentralized ID, so that you have a wallet attached to the car that has the full history of the maintenance records and any other, it's registration history, perhaps it's insurance history, that basically that can attach to the car. So when you sell the car to someone else, they have that complete record. You're not scrambling through, your files for the receipts you got from the auto shop and that sort of thing, and all these different formats. It's there collectively in a digital format and can be passed on to the next owner. And I think for high value objects, I mean, we're seeing this in traceability and supply chains, the diamond supply chain, that sort of thing. Identity of these objects is the key to being able to talk about a kind of a history and attach that in this kind of decentralized identity kind of world.
Maybe the car will also kind of tell how it feels about itself. Hey, I'm first year, there are going to be some bugs, and I feel kind of bad about that. But anyway, it is what it is.
And this maybe gets us back to where we can talk a little bit about not just governments, but also large organizations around the world and how they're doing this, which is, you can test things by whether those identifiers are following them around. And we want to be able to give people a wallet, but we can't just start from nothing, right? So what Kiva has been doing is helping the civil registries onboard all their citizens with a wallet. So that even if they don't have a digital device, they can interact with a wallet that is theirs, that represents them, by using another authentication factor. And from a user standpoint, this looks just like a service that might use a magic email link, a service that might use text message OTP, or a service that uses a biometric or a retinal scan, because then when they show up at an organization, they can authenticate, and then they get access to all that wallet of credentials. And now we can start making all that data move around in all different directions. And you might actually be surprised if you're a customer of quite a few credit unions in the United States, you might already have one of these self-sovereign identity wallets. If you're a citizen of the countries Kiva has been working with, your civil registry might have migrated some of your national information into a self-sovereign identity wallet. And we're seeing more and more of these systems start to be built up in various places. And it makes it so that even if you don't have a device, even if you're not part of that part of the digital divide, you can still participate, and we can bootstrap this protocol and start to turn that control over back to those relationships that matter.
I'm looking here at the 45 questions that have been asked. and realizing we're not really going to get to any of them. I think that when we write this up, what we should do maybe is pick a bunch of these questions, and we'll provide each of the panelists an opportunity to just say a couple of things about it if you'd be prepared to do that. And again, this is such a rich conversation. I apologize to all of you out there who are listening. We're talking about, closing here, about how to get there. And there's a role for government. Brian, do you want to add some thoughts to civil society, the private sector?
Oh, this will take. This will be the kind of thing that, like the internet, it touches every institution, and there's certainly a role for even the big existing, media companies and telco companies. Facebook could certainly issue verifiable credentials that talk about kind of your big accomplishments on the Facebook network. Apple and Google, no doubt, will have capacity for this in their wallets. I think, at least. I'm not predicting or releasing any sensitive information there, but this is, they have wallet products in the market, and they have a role like that in people's lives today. But even think about this, Microsoft owns LinkedIn. LinkedIn is essentially everyone's CV these days, virtual CV. Your virtual diploma issued as a verifiable credential should be something that gets a green check on it when you list it as having attended a college or something like that, right? Can we reinvent how LinkedIn and other systems work to be based on verifiable data like this, and be generators of that? I think it's the same kind of transformation as even the original internet brought to how society works. So we're all incredibly enthused. The vaccination credential use case is front of mind for so many of us right now, because that's where the rubber is hitting the road in 2021. And we hope good things come out of that.
Yeah, and eventually a credential like that could expand into a full sovereign healthcare record, which could expand into something much bigger. And that's sort of our view here, is this going to happen top down or bottom? Actually, it's going to happen top down, bottom up, sideways, diagonally, and corkscrew. Like
a good decentralized effort. This is a real thing that's actually going on. In fact, the Net Identity Workshop is going on right now, and there's people working in all the different use cases that we've talked about, be it carbon credits, supply chain, government ID cards, financial inclusion, healthcare. There's people doing real deployments for real things all over the place. So, it's fun to be a part of it.
Yeah, if I could, it's Earth Day today, and in BC, one of the use cases that the government's actually working on is enabling the tracking of emissions and greenhouse gas and climate change. The Open Earth Foundation has a project based around this. Much of Open Earth Foundation relies on authentic data. If in order to be able to track data, to track climate impacts, you need reliable data. A PDF report from an Excel spreadsheet isn't going to cut it. And so you need to take things that emit trusted data and share those data across your supply chain. Show it to your customers. Show that you are a sustainable organization. That's going to lead to investment. That's going to lead into all sorts of things. So that's a big part of it.
I think you can think of it like building a movement, really. Now, let me end what they thought, and then each of you just have 30 seconds to wrap up. But if there is a movement and the relationship of forces starts to change, and this becomes a really big issue, do we in fact get to the point where these huge companies start to pay attention to this? And I mentioned Satya Nadella, but I thought I would write a letter for Mark Zuckerberg just to issue in about 6 months from now, or next January the 2nd. It's, dear Facebook users, we built our company on the notion that we own our data. That worked well for years, but we now understand this is not viable nor the right thing to do. You will see a new Facebook soon, where the data you create is owned and controlled by you. We will purchase this data from you and build a new business model founded on integrity. This will hurt our revenue and stock price initially, but ultimately enable to create a more sustainable and accessible company for the years ahead. Stay tuned, Mark. I don't know if Mark is Mark on this conference? He might be, and if he is, Mark, I'll send this directly to you. But is fine line between vision and hallucination. I'll let you each have a 30-second wrap up, and feel free to comment on the letter if you want.
Don, I think you and I are one of the few remaining techno optimists out there. So I like that optimism. I'm choosing to focus on other targets right now in terms of conversion to the vision. But definitely believe that this is a movement that will make its own case to everybody in the fullness of time.
My view is that as soon as you look at verifiable credentials, that concept, the things behind this, everything you look at thereafter will be in that lens, and you'll see so many use cases. We constantly get that message back from us. As soon as you start realizing that you can actually trust things that you get on the internet, that information that you get on the internet, it changes everything.
Nathan.
We all have to hold the vendors we work with accountable on these things. We have to ask good questions about identifiers, especially as the businesses involved in these networks. If you're going to a CRM system, if you're going to an enterprise management system, ask them how the relationships within your data work. You don't want to sell out your business advantage because the system doesn't respect your privacy. No more so on Facebook than you would with any other business system that you might adopt and use. And this is where the engineers underneath didn't know they could do some of these cool things before, and they are paying attention, but they don't know whether they can justify it, whether their customers want to pay for it or want the features that come with it. So we've got to start asking for it. We've got to start demanding it. And we are seeing these engineers from all these different organizations pay attention. I think from my standpoint, it is inevitable because it's simply a better way of having a relationship with your customer. And when the customer is happier with you than they are with your competitor, good things happen.
All right. Well, wow, that was amazing. Talk about a high bandwidth conversation. We will be writing this up, but it's going to our Director of Research, Kirsten Sandberg's enormously capable, and her team will be turning this into a document. All of you who have been attending this webinar will receive a copy of the document, and it will be Creative Commons, so feel free to distribute it broadly. And I'll close by saying, if this is a movement to get back our autonomy as individuals, our privacy, our ability to be prosperous and to be secure, and also to function in a society where data can be used for social purposes, then this is a movement worth joining. So join the movement, and we'll see you all for the next webinar. Thanks so much, Brian, Stephen, and Nathan. What a great conversation. Take care.
Bye.